So let's talk a little bit about Ensoniq. If you ever get a chance, go on the internet and read the story on Ensoniq. Very interesting story. It's very fascinating, actually. And I'm almost going to say they're sort of almost like the fourth leg of the big three. Of course, Corg, Yamaha, and Roland. Now, Ensoniq obviously is no longer in business. But their instruments were very forward-thinking and really as an alternative, almost like what Apple was to the computer industry. They just did things a whole different way. And the workstations, which they were well in depth into, like the VFX, SD, the MR61, the TS10, the EPS 16 Plus, the ASR10, and then they made the ASRX, and they made one called the ASR X88, and a few other derivatives of those instruments. But the truth is if you talk to people, now I was not a big workstation user of the Ensoniqs. I used them for the sounds. But if you talk to those people that use the ASR and the TS10s, they swear by it. I have a friend of mine, Dennis, that swears by it. And he's looking for one even to this day, like right now. Because the fond memories of using it was just so intuitive. And that's really what they say. It's funny because I bought an MR61 in 2019, somewhere around then. And it turns out that the person I bought it from was one of the original reps for Ensoniq. He worked out in New York and so forth. And he talked about using a lot of musicians, the company did, as they were designing the software, like the sequencers, the samplers. And they were using jazz musicians, pop musicians, R&B. And they took a lot of input when they were creating the instruments. So, but at the end of the day, we're talking about in the late 90s, very, very late 90s, the buyout of the company ended up getting repurposed for what we now know and can look back as the computer revolution of the millennium. And that's when, computers became extremely ubiquitous in computer building, computer shows. We all remember CompUSA, the big store, which is no longer around. But that's Ensoniq. Okay, before we move on to the Mega workstations, I do want to give some recognition, shout out to Open Labs Nico. Although it's basically a PC with software, and it kind of reminds me of not the Muse, but that came out around that time, and they were very, very expensive. I'm actually looking at eBay, and you have someone selling a Nico Labs from 2010 for over $7,500. That may or may not be expensive, just depends on the context, I guess. But it was basically, taking a PC, stuffing it in a chassis that had a touch screen way before its time, and hardware to control all the software inside. So it was very sort of pretty unique. Probably not as unique as the way Ensoniq approached their workstations, but nevertheless, and obviously it's something I have very little experience with, but I know it exists, and I know one or two people that have had one. So let's give Open Labs a shout out. Okay, we're going to spend a little bit of time on Korg. They're sort of a big deal here. And it's 2005, and PCs are extremely ubiquitous. They're more affordable than ever, and they can run all the music software, and plugins are starting to become more and more accepted. Hardware is no longer being, especially the vintage hardware and vintage digital, so you could pick up a JD 990 for $300, and easily you can find it JV 2080, $200. And so hardware is becoming less and less being sought after. The only problem is the software developers were not the big three. And so Yamaha, Corg, and Roland were really struggling with having a reason to even exist, and they're losing market share a lot. And so in 2005, the Oasis is born. Now, it was extremely expensive, but it was definitely a valiant attempt of technical prowess for Korg to show that they still have reason for being. And you look back at the Oasis, as you can see, the EX1, these different engines. Now, you had to buy those engines. They didn't come with the keyboard, but it was highly expandable, and it was incredible. And really, the artistry of design was really phenomenal. Only people I saw using it were people like Herbie Hancock, Jordan Rudess. But it would be shortly after some of that technology spilled into more of an affordable form factor, which is called the Korg M3, as you can see here. Now, ironically, a little pet peeve I had with it. It had the same problems with the Triton as far as the paint job, where your fingers and it collected grease and dirt, and you couldn't get it off. But notwithstanding that, it offered a lot of the sample technology that the Oasis had at more of an affordable price. Now, it was still expensive, but it wasn't $8,000 like the Oasis. Now, ironically, the 61, and then they had a 73 and an 88 key model, and the two latter models could accept a hardware module of the Korg Radius. So you would have like two modules side by side. But pretty interesting, very forward thinking. I never saw anyone with it, and so I don't really have anything to say on how well it worked and how well it integrated. But it was nevertheless a very forward thinking thing. Now, that was around for a while. So we're talking about between 2005 when the Oasis came out, and that it must have been around for probably about 3 years, maybe a little longer. They did have an M50, which was sort of the same shape, but it was a scaled down version. I really actually don't know a whole lot about that. That one didn't actually appeal to me. However, the Korg Kronos in 2011 was more streamed down than the Oasis, but it wasn't cheap and streamed down. It was just more of a efficient, elegant design of what we know as a Radius. And you see the 9 engines, and these were engines that you did not have to buy. And this is sort of where at this time it's been well established that if you're going to release a synthesizer or a workstation, you're going to have thousands and thousands of sounds, because they're trying to keep up with the software manufacturers, plugin manufacturers that had thousands and thousands of sounds. And that kind of ushers in sort of a new standard. You're going to have thousands of sounds, and you're going to have higher samples, and in this case, you're going to have virtualization and these technologies in here that give you your sound more dimension and more option for sounds. The Korg Kronos, which I had the original one, the 73, was one of my favorite keyboards to this day. Now, the Kronos was around for a long time, and it wasn't long before the Kronos X came out, and that improved upon some heating issues that they had, because the fans in the original Kronos the actual Kronos itself overheated, and you could hear the fans turn on running all the time. But it still used that same platform. I think it was not the Sharp RISC processors, but I think they're the Atom processors inside the dual core. Either way, the Korg Kronos still still holds up to even the stuff that's released out now, and to plugins that are even out right now, or even out even then. It's still, so one of the beauty, the things behind the Kronos is that the effects were really good and they were very flexible, and that was a really big part of its sound. Still to this day more flexible than anything else that's out there, at least in my opinion. Now the Nautilus, this is where you kind of get to the part where the technology gets sort of refolded into something that I feel is more of a stepping stone. What do you call that? A filler, until the company figures out where they're going with their next flagship. In other words, they took everything in the Kronos, they lowered the price a lot, they put it in a plastic case. But in this case, they did some refinements on there that were well needed, probably with the user interface. So as you can see, the Nautilus doesn't have a lot of buttons. Well, the fact of the matter is the Kronos, as many buttons and sliders as they had, they weren't very useful. The touchscreen, the Kronos relied on the touchscreen way too much. And Corg's always been that way. They were like a minimalist in their form meets function, starting with the O1W, M1, T-Series, Trinity, Triton. You know where I'm going with this. So Nautilus was sort of like that spacer until they were to come out with something. Now I've been screaming about Korg to release a new hardware platform. Realize it takes about 5 to 7 years, I was told, for a new platform design, because you're basically writing software for hardware that's not even out yet. And usually because they're writing what they call to the metal, that even with older hardware that's not up to par, like right now, the hardware will perform extremely well on it because they're writing to the metal itself, as opposed to using a version of Windows, which is not as efficient, or Mac OS, which is not as efficient. But this year, 2023, I predict that something is either not going to come out and never going to come out because the company is going at a different route philosophically, or if they do come out with another workstation, which I truly hope they do, they take a lot of feedback and will consider a lot of the feedback that the working professionals and other musicians on how to build an interface that works extremely well with their next workstation, if they're coming out with one. I envision that the Op6, the Mod Wave, that kind of software will be in the next workstation, and so that they can sort of be more extensible, almost like what the Zen Core is doing for Roland, but a better execution or implementation of that kind of technology. So that's Korg. So it's 2019, and it's been years for Roland for a major platform release. We're talking about since the Phantom G, literally. They did release the Phantom 06 and some of the cheaper stuff, like you see in this video of this guy talking about the cheap stuff, and then you'll see him sort of lift it up and say voila, right? Phantom G. So as far as the hardware, fantastic. There's nothing cheap about it. But as far as what's on the inside, had a lot less to be desired. They had the bones and the Zen Core architecture, so it had a lot of promise. It just wasn't able to deliver on day one. It wasn't until about, I would say, software minimally 2.0 where it started to more develop and mature. By that time, my patience sort of wore, and I had too much personal frustration with it, and truly couldn't envision it going a whole lot of places. So I ended up selling it. Now, I gave it another shot, and I worked out a deal with someone and bought a Phantom 6, which I have here in the studio today, and I've installed the 3.2 2 software on it, firmware. And I kind of use it, and it seems to me, if you dig deep enough, you can really, like anything else, you can really do some damage on it and do some nice stuff on it. But for me, where I'm at since then, since 2019, I've sort of grown away from sort of this new standard of having 16,000 sounds on board. So those of you out there, you probably know what I'm talking about when you use Omnisphere or you use a Kronos or you use a Montage or whatever you have. That the newer stuff that's out now just has too many sounds in it. That's at least how I feel. Now, what I'm finding out is that the Zen Core, which is sort of the flagship platform that Roland's using right now, it sort of delivers the gear of your dreams within the firmware update and within software, but at the same time, at some point, the user interface on it becomes challenging to be able to use all the stuff that they add to it. So I found after owning a Jupiter X that getting around on all the engines wasn't as elegant as I thought it would be. And so whenever it gets to the point where you're not using something because of its form and function, that's not a good thing. So for example, if I'm in the studio here and I'm using the Phantom 6 and I'm no longer using the sequencer anymore, and I'm finding that there's too many sounds or not enough sounds that I like in it, where I'm going to something else, that's not a good sign. And so I question manufacturers today whether quantity beats usability. Not quality, but usability. And maybe it's just that they got to the point where they have to please everyone in between, and so forth and so on. So, and you can blame partly software like Contact and Air Instruments and all that for ushering that in that quantity space race. Can we have 1,300 synth bases? Is that enough? Or can we have 800 risers? I remember getting the Moog tribute library for Omnisphere. Well, the Moog didn't do 900 sounds. It did 7 sounds, but yet there's 900 sounds on it. So it's just an interesting question to raise. But nevertheless, 2024 and the Phantom still exists. You can start seeing some of the age on it because the Enzyme, the V Piano, and their DCB modeling has limitations because of the hardware. You cannot run all that stuff at one time, so you have to kind of like the JD800 model on the Jupiter X. You can only run it on that first block because of the limitation of the architecture. And so this ushers in sort of a new way of thinking, a new way of doing these new workstations, and the Phantom that came out in 2019 still lives. But I still see at some point they're gonna have to advance that hardware so it can run some of the newer updates that they plan on likely doing in the future. Okay, here we have is the Yamaha Montage. Pretty interesting instrument. So really what we're looking here is the Montage M, which just came out actually. But the Montage M is really more closer to the Yamaha Montage than it is actually a whole different platform. Okay, so there's a lot of things that have been improved on it, especially the actual user interface. But in the internals are really essentially a Montage. And the thing is 2016, when the original Montage came out, they had an opportunity to release a whole nother platform, and Yamaha evidently chose to stick with what they knew worked for them in the past, which obviously was the Motif. So the Motif So as far as I'm concerned, as long as you have the motif and you're within that architecture, and you're not doing it virtually, you're doing it like not like virtually like the Zencore. You actually have the motif engine in there. As long as you got the AWM engine and that architecture, maybe it becomes more difficult to get away from that. That's just my own personal opinion. I did buy in Montage M, and I quickly realized that not a lot has changed, and the things that have changed either weren't fully baked or implemented yet. So that's saying, learning from owning the Phantom, remember, you can't always rely on a firmware update to fix everything. And that was the case with my Novation Summit as well. The firmware was just horrible. So I quickly took it back, and I told myself I was going to watch from the sidelines and look at the firmware updates. But I had to see it myself, because all the promotional videos aren't going to tell you what they didn't do. Okay. And so, but clearly what you could see with the Yamaha Montage, of course the Phantom, and even the Kronos, is that workstations, because of the space race with plugins and the competition, it's just the way it is. You're going to have 6,000 to 7,000 sounds inside your workstation. And that's something that sort of grew away from. I look at that more of a detriment than a benefit personally. But maybe that works for other people. So this is sort of where we are with the current platform of Yamaha, as I talked about Roland. And I truly still feel that Korg is going to release another game-changing platform, whether it's hardware or whether it's all on software. I was hoping to see it this year. Really counting on just seeing something this year. But we'll see what happens. Last but not least, we have the NPC Keys. Now this kind of reminds me a little bit of the Open Labs Nico, sort of just an outsider. And Akai tried to sort of put these plugins in here so that it would resemble a lot of what we're comfortable with from VSTs, so they have a lot of bread and butter. Clearly they're marketing this to another demographic outside of beat makers, people like that actually played traditional workstations like from the Corg, Yamaha, Roland. But somewhere in that attempt they fell short, whether it was just a marketing or whether it was the actual plugins, or just maybe a demographic thing where it's just hard to grab people away from what they're comfortable with, which I personally can attest that was my problem. Now I've owned this NPC Keys for the better part of maybe half a year. And the one thing that I found myself, and there's other people out there like Jim Daniker, Junkie XL, and we're kind of like 3%ers out there where you're willing to take something and make it your own, sample your own sounds. And maybe you have the rich history like I do with a lot of old gear. And so through that perspective, you're willing to know what you like by now, and you'll make your own sample libraries. And for those people that are out there that are like that, the NPC is almost like an ASR on steroids, if you will. And so I highly endorse and recommend that if you are one of those people, that you can make this NPC a workstation. It's the reverse process. Instead of starting with 12,000 sounds, you start with 0 sounds. But what you end up doing is you're creating a custom instrument, and then you're taking those plugins or whatever you have, or if you still like the hardware, you're using that as sort of a supplementary. It's the opposite. Those things that used to be as primary are now supplementary. They're like third, fourth options. But your library that you create is your first option. And I'm here to say that if you are one of those 3%ers, I highly endorse the NPC platform, the new one I'm talking about, not the old one, as something that you'd seriously consider when looking at modern workstations of today. I kind of hope, as I said earlier about the Korg, that eventually they come out with something that's so compelling that it takes me away from it, but I don't think that's ever going to happen, because what I have right now is just, it cannot be beaten by any workstation. So that's pretty much a wrap up on the past to modern workstations.